For the most updated version of the Glyphs RPG blueprint, tokens, accessories and resources, please visit www.glyphsrpg.com. Also visit 2ddice.com for our internationally popular D20 RPG coins and our other masterful coin works.
Welcome to Chapter 9, the Apparel chapter. In my opinion, this is probably one of the most optional chapters in the book because basically it discusses the role of character apparel and how it can affect gameplay and the character's overall well-being. Okay, so most people in most games will never even use apparel. They simply describe what their character is wearing and get on with their game or whatever, except magic items or whatnot. That's fine, but for those of you who are interested in more realism or are interested in the potential impact that the right kind or the wrong kind of clothing can have on your game, then this chapter is definitely a must read because we're going to be looking at the roles of apparel in a couple different ways. Okay, so basically clothing serves two basic purposes. Okay, so it protects your character from the environment, and it projects a specific image that stimulates the character's appearance in a positive manner mostly, or sometimes a negative manner during a social encounter. And I guess you could say a third way is it affects your character's overall comfort, which affects the recovery of ether points that have been expended. So let's take a look at how exactly that works. Okay, so here on page 176 we have three different values that we look at when we talk about apparel, if you're even tracking it. Like I said, in most situations there's just not enough time for it, but if you want a realistic campaign or one that emphasizes survival, or on the flip side, if you're in a setting to where talking and social interaction are more important than combat, you may want to influence an NPC with your stylish looks or your wealth. You know, you may have some very fancy or jewelry, and those things can have an impact on how an NPC perceives you. So those are the things that are optional and that are there for your usage if you see fit. Real quick, let's take a look at what we mean by that. So here we have the three different index values, the index categories that we look at when we consider apparel if you're going to be using these values in your game. So first we have here what's known as the environment index. So what that is, it basically indicates an article of clothing's coverage, and more importantly the level of effectiveness in different environments and temperatures. Okay, now those will be explained further in the environments chapter. Okay, so we will get into that a little bit later, but right now we just need to know that so basically low EN or environment indexes are ideal for warm climates. Okay, so less is better in that case, I guess you could say, while higher indexes are critical for cold or wet or otherwise very harsh climates. Okay, so generally an article's EN or index value or environment index value only applies to the bodily surface it covers. So if, for example, the total EN values are too high or too low for the specific environment that the character's in, then the architect can impose penalties which match up with the preservation metric, which we're going to talk about in the attributes chapter. Okay, now one thing about environment index, there's a much quicker way to look at it here than counting every single article of clothing. Okay, so let's look real quick here at the different numbers that we look at. So an EN1 through an EN4. Okay, and each of these ones also have 1 through 4 also. So that's how they're broken down here by rank. So an EN1 means an environment index of 1, which means there is no protection whatsoever from cold or rain or other inclement elements. Okay, so the weakest form of coverage is what that means. Whereas an index of 4, an environment index of 4, offers protection against the most extreme cold and inhospitable weather conditions imaginable. So those are the 4 different extremes that we look at. Now, as you're going to see here shortly, there are charts that are available for a multitude of different clothing articles. Now, I do not recommend, when you're creating a character, counting every single piece of clothing. That is impractical and it's a waste of time. Okay, those are there for your reference if in the event that your character is only wearing certain clothing items depending on the situation. That is just there for reference. But most of the time, you want to resort to this part here, which is basically the quick EN or environment index summary. So what that means is basically you don't have to track every single index value for every single article of clothing. Okay, made that easy for you. Okay, so what that means is basically it's a quick way to summarize coverage for different conditions. So real quick, an EN1 just means your character is scantily clothed, okay, very lightly clothed, and it covers temperature index of 1 to 3, okay, and like I said, we'll learn about that in the environments chapter. So an EN2 just means they're casually clothed. So most people are going to be in the EN2 ranks, I would say, most average people. An EN3 means they're heavily clothed, and an EN4 means they're clothed for the most extreme conditions imaginable. So Arctic weather and even outer space if they're wearing a suit and so forth. So just an example of how those play out. Okay, so the next index that we look at is the image. Now that's important for characters. They want to show off how rich they are or how influential they are, or if they're playing a noble character and they want to fit into society and they want to influence people, or sell their clothing for a lot of money for that matter. So that's when that would come into play. Okay, so another thing that it does specifically is that it boosts the wearer's impression modifier score. So if you're in a situation where you're doing an attribute check using your impression modifier, if you're trying to influence somebody with that metric, then wearing the right apparel in the article and accessories and stuff can definitely influence that. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so the image index is proportionate to the quality of clothing article's material, its design. Okay, so very expensive designer clothes, rare jewelry, fancy shoes, things like that can influence the image index. Okay, so real quick here also, okay, the image index is specifically relative to the observer. So it only applies to things that an NPC or another character can actually see, because how could it possibly know what it can't see, right? So for character creation purposes, the IM or image index is an average of all IM index values pertaining to visible articles, okay? So that, like I said, boosts the impression modifier. So let's say you have a total IM index value of, let's say, 3, right? When it averages out, let's just say, then you could add 3 to your impression modifier score. That's what that means. So an IM1 here simply means that the article is worthless or it's in ragged, tattered, horrible condition. An IM2 simply means it's cheap or moderate value pricing and it's in fair condition. An IM3 means it's expensive or exclusively priced and it's in pretty good condition. And an IM4 is exotic and it's in immaculate condition. So those are different ways that you can look at the IM index. Now finally, another very important metric here pertaining to apparel is the comfort index. Okay, now that specifically affects the hourly recovery rate for ether points. So if you expend, let's say, 10 ether points using powers or techniques or whatever, now every hour, as we're going to learn in the ether chapter, they do recover up to a certain amount. Now, wearing the right clothing or the wrong clothing can have an impact on that, okay? And that's where the comfort index goes in, or the CF is what that means, okay? So in your character booklet, okay, the CF index is an average of all CF index values, okay? So let's take a look at the different ones here. So CF1 means your character's clothing is very rigid, it's very tight, it's very restricting. So if your character is clothed that way, then there is no hourly ether recover because they're very encumbered, I guess you could say. Okay, a CF2 or comfort index of 2 means it's just the right fit and it doesn't have any bearing whatsoever on the hourly ether recovery. So most people will fall into that category. A CF3 means it's pretty comfortable and it gives you an extra ether point to the totally hourly recovery. So pretty nice there. And finally we have a CF4 here, which basically is the most custom tailored suit. You know, the clothing article or the whole outfit is specifically made for that one character. So the best fit imaginable. And that gives you +2 to the total hourly ether recovery. Okay, so that's what that means. Okay, now real quick, these are the charts that I was talking about that do go over the default clothing articles. There's a whole slew of options here and the default values here for their indexes. Okay, that's just there for reference. I don't recommend counting every single one. I just recommend averaging them out like we talked about up here, but they are there for your reference. Okay, so this page here, page 1, simply talks about pricing your apparel items based on their index value. So here, just take a look here. We have index values, environment index, image index, and comfort index. And the pricing, the default pricing here is given for each index value of what we recommend to price it on. So let's say you're having a character that's going out in very harsh environmental conditions. You need the right outfit to do that. So that would be, in my opinion, an EN of 4. So that pricing should be moderate at the very least, I would think. Let's say you have a character who needs a very fancy, very stylish, very expensive looking outfit, okay, to show off to the high society people in their town, let's just say. So their priority would be an IM index, so an image index, right? Okay, so let's say that here that they're getting something with an IM index value of 3, so that would be priced at expensive and so forth. So finally we get the CF index. Maybe this character is a monk or a magician, and they need to prioritize the ether recovery more than they do their environment, with their environment of tolerance or their image to other people. Let's say they prioritize that, then they would prioritize a higher comfort index here, and that's priced accordingly to here. So when you're creating apparel articles, okay, there's some example materials there, but you want to factor on all of these values here when you're creating your pricing. That gives you a better idea of what to price them. So again, page 180, these are just some example common materials that are used in different types of clothing, just to give you some ideas. And finally, we have some basic instructions on how to create an apparel article like we talked about here. Okay, so as an example, let's talk about a tailored cloak, a very fancy, nice tailored cloak. Okay, now this example basically illustrates a cloak that's made of cashmere and colored in a very fancy red crimson dye. And in your setting, let's say the material, it's a lot more costly than other fabrics and materials out there, and it's got a beautiful level of physical appeal to it, so it's ideal for nobility, I guess you could say. Okay, it's very light. It's got nice insulation to it though, and you want to reflect that in the numbers. Okay, so by default, that particular item, I would say, has an environment index of 3, an image index of 3, and a comfort level of 3. Okay, so that's how I personally rank those items. You do as you please as you're creating your own articles, if the campaign even needs you to. Okay, and then here's an example of how they're priced. And finally, we have a total bit value here based on the index value. So that's that pretty much covers it for apparel. So it just gives you some ideas of how to use it for your campaigns and how you can customize it based on the particular setting, and how to price articles based on what they're used for. So that covers it for the apparel chapter. Now, without further ado, I would like to move on to the attributes chapter in detail.